3. Welcome back to another episode. In this episode, we have a well-established researcher and pharmacist whose name is Yasmin. Yasmin, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Yasmin Abdulaziz. I'm a New Zealand registered pharmacist and a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto currently.
Awesome. So let's start with the very first question, which is how did you discover your passion for the profession of pharmacy?
Yeah. So it's kind of an interesting story because I wanted to be a pharmacist ever since I was 13 years old. But the way that I discovered pharmacy was kind of by pure coincidence. So it's not like I had, a family member who's a pharmacist or I was inspired by our family pharmacist. So basically what happened when I was 13 years old, I was attending a school overseas in Malaysia. And every year, what this school did is it brought in universities from around the city. So from around Kuala Lumpur, around Malaysia, and sometimes even some international universities. And what we would do as students is we'd go kind of class by class, go around the expo, ask any questions that we might have about potential careers we're thinking of. And as you probably know, at 13 years old, you kind of haven't really thought too deeply about what you want to do when you grow up, or it's a little bit rare for people to have decided at that point. So basically, I turn up to this expo with the rest of my classmates, and we go around booth by booth, and I just pick up these random brochures and I put them in my school bag. And I remember that night I went home and I opened my school bag to get it ready for the next day, and I took out all these brochures. And actually, I picked them up and I wanted to put them straight in the bin or in the trash, as you guys say here in Canada. And then I figured, why not go through them and kind of see what they're about? So there were brochures for pretty much everything under the sun: maths, law, medicine. And then I pick up the one for pharmacy. And I gotta admit, I actually had no idea what pharmacy was about, what a pharmacist did. And I remember that night, just looking through the brochure, I decided to go and have a chat to my mom. And I said, "Hey, mom, what is a pharmacist? What does a pharmacist do?" And it was my mom's explanation of the profession about how pharmacists are medicines experts, pharmacists know exactly how a medication works. It got me kind of interested in the career. And so, I delved into it a little bit deeper. And pretty much ever since that night, the goal was to become a pharmacist.
Oh, that's a very incredible and inspiring story, to be honest.
Very random, but it worked out.
Yeah, happy it did. So how was it like studying pharmacy in New Zealand?
Oh, goodness. What would you like to know?
So basically, the program, the scope of practice, like any internships or extracurricular activities you had.
Sure. Awesome. Okay. So in New Zealand, our program is a little bit different than in Canada. So in New Zealand, once you graduate high school, you have the ability to apply for university. And what ends up happening is you can apply to any course. So in New Zealand, at the University of Otago, we have something called Health Sciences First Year. So it's a prerequisite year for any student who wants to go into any sort of medical field, like medicine, dentistry. We call it medical laboratory sciences, pharmacy, even sort of we call it oral health, so dental hygiene. So we have about 1,300 students go into this health science first year course. And of course, it's a 1 year course. And the whole idea is that the students that score the highest then get divvied up into whatever program that they want to go into. So you start with 1,300 students and you end up with 500 students split across medicine, dentistry, pharmacy, and so on. So that's kind of the first requirement. So once you make it through, you've got 3 years at pharmacy school. And at the end of that, you graduate with a Bachelor of Pharmacy. But that's not the end of the road, because in New Zealand, we have to do 1 year internship. So this internship can be either at a community pharmacy or a hospital pharmacy, and you go about applying for it as if you would apply for a residency here in Canada. But the idea of the internship is that you would basically finish a number of different tasks. It's sort of learning on the job. It gives you practical experience. It is a paid internship, by the way. And at the end of that, you sit your licensing exam. Once you sit your licensing exam, that's it. You're registered, provided that you pass. So it is a little bit different from the Canadian system and what I've sort of come to learn over the past sort of year and 8 months while I've been teaching. The content obviously is more or less the same as what you learn in Canada, but of course in New Zealand, we graduate with a Bachelor of Pharmacy. So our pharmacy program is a little shorter than it is here. And PharmDs are not currently offered in any university in New Zealand. Um, but yeah, so that's kind of the New Zealand pharmacy program in a nutshell. In terms of our scope of practice, I think one of the things that really attracted me to come to Canada and do my postdoctoral fellowship here is the fact that you guys have very expanded scopes of practice for pharmacists. Of course, it is variable across your provinces, but for the most part, you are able to do a lot more than a pharmacist in New Zealand can do. So, for example, the minor ailments prescribing service in New Zealand, we don't quite have a formalized service, if you like. So, not a service that's remunerated based on consultations. We won't be able to prescribe for minor ailments. But on the other side of the coin, we also are a little bit ahead compared to Canada in some ways. So we've already been doing prescribing for urinary tract infections, the resupply of oral contraceptives, and even prescribing for erectile dysfunction. So there are certain conditions and certain medications that we have the authority to prescribe and provide. But I would say, for the most part, it would be nice if it's always good to learn from each other in terms of pharmacy practice, and I guess on the job, again, more or less the same as what Canadian pharmacists get up to.
Amazing. So how would you describe like your experience coming to Canada? Like what was some of the factors which influenced you to actually consider Canada?
Yeah, so actually, I visited Canada in 2019 and I came specifically to attend the Canadian Pharmacists Association conference. And so at that time, I was still a PhD student at the University of Otago. I was still working as a pharmacist. I was a relief pharmacist because it was very important for me to keep up with my practice because a lot of my practice informs my research, informs me teaching. And so at that time, I was working under the supervision of a Canadian professor, Professor Carlo Mara. And, we decided that coming to CPHA, coming to that conference would be a great platform for me to share my PhD findings. And at the time, my PhD looked at funding of pharmacy services. So we specifically looked at all the services that pharmacists provide that do not get any funding from the government, insurance companies, or even out of pocket payments. And I'll give you an example. A service that we do in New Zealand that doesn't get reimbursed is minor ailments. So any sort of over-the-counter advice, if you like, for minor conditions, things around wound care, things around mental health services. A lot of those are given because pharmacists recognize that there's a need in the community, but unfortunately it isn't reimbursed. So that in a nutshell is the PhD. I came over to Canada for a week and here in Toronto, in fact, I presented my findings. The project, I guess, won an award. And then it was that week just walking around Toronto, seeing, I guess, how enthusiastic and motivated and how much momentum there was in the field of pharmacy and how much I always like to think of it as, Canadian pharmacists being pushers. You guys, when you want something, you really keep pushing and pushing and pushing for it. And that's quite an inspiring thing, I guess, for a young pharmacist. Also, your expanded scope was another thing that made me very interested in, exploring pharmacy here. And it was basically in that 1 week, fell in love with Toronto, fell in love with the city, fell in love with how the profession was going here. And I decided, it would be an ideal place to come back to and do my postdoctoral fellowship in the space of pharmacy practice.
Amazing. And what inspired you to choose your UofT as your university of choice?
Oh goodness, I guess because I was in Toronto, and obviously, U of T, it's world class in research. You've got a lot of, Canadian pharmacy leaders working at U of T. Again, it's just, I guess, the depth of research that's at U of T that inspired me to want to be a part of it, to I guess, really grow professionally. And I think that's really the opportunity that U of T has given me. Um, the amount of professional growth, the amount of research projects I'm involved in, the inspiring people I've met along the way. I'm lucky in that a lot of the research that I do, I engage with sector organizations like the Ontario College of Pharmacists, the Ontario Pharmacists Association, sometimes even the Ontario Ministry of Health. I guess U of T is the perfect place for that sort of thing.
Incredible. Tell us a bit about your research.
Yeah. Following on, I guess, from my PhD thesis looking at funding of pharmacy services, what felt like a natural follow on from that is my thesis found that in New Zealand, the top unfunded service that was provided by pharmacists was indeed minor ailments. And so I finished my PhD in May of 2021. And by July of 2022, Ontario announced that, come the 1st of January 2023, pharmacists would be given the authority to prescribe for 13 common or minor ailments. And I guess it just felt like the natural progression to go into that space. In New Zealand, we have been thinking about implementing a similar minor ailment service. There are a few differences here and there, but for the most part, we would also be looking at those minor ailment conditions. So it felt like, it's good to kind of come here, learn a few lessons, see how we can implement similar things back home. And so for the most part, my research evaluates the minor ailment service here in Ontario. I am primarily a qualitative researcher, so I do mix methods, but primarily I love talking to people. I love engaging with patients, and I love, trying to find out from patients whether or not the services that we as pharmacists provide actually meet patient health needs, or if we're sort of falling under the, I guess, if we're falling short, or perhaps we're providing services that patients don't really benefit from.
Perfect. So tell us a bit about your work experience as a pharmacist, especially your experience as a locum pharmacist.
Yeah, okay. So when I graduated from pharmacy school, I actually did my internship in hospital. So I have hospital pharmacy practice. And then, shortly after, actually what ended up happening is it's quite interesting when you first become a pharmacist because you start, especially, I guess, having fresh eyes, you start looking at the way services are delivered, the barriers that your patients might face. And then that really gets you thinking about how you can improve the system, how you can make it easier for patients to access care, how there are some barriers that you can possibly work towards removing. And so, you know, that for me, when I saw those things in the hospital practice, inspired me to go in and continue my education and do research and take those, like I said, practice-based problems and figure out ways that we can solve them. So a lot of the research that I have done previously and that I currently do, I try and make it very pharmacy practice focused, research that can achieve impact, research that is in collaboration with a lot of knowledge users. So that kind of is my research from that point of view. But also my experiences, like after I enrolled in the PhD program at the University of Otago, again, I thought I didn't want to give up my license, first of all, but I also didn't want to give up my practice experience. And the reason why is I think personally, for this is only my opinion, but I didn't really want to fall under the trap of being sort of siloed and thinking, okay, well, these are all these amazing things that the research has shown, but it's actually very hard to implement in practice. So being aware of the practice challenges and then tailoring your research around that helps you think of methods that you can implement that can actually be integrated into current pharmacy practice, as opposed to these things that look great on paper, but once you implement them, or they are difficult to implement in practice.
That's amazing. And what are some like potential career pathways you might pursue like once you're finished with your
Yeah.
postdoctoral?
Yeah, so I guess for me, I love research. I love teaching. It was actually the whole reason that I wanted to do a PhD and I want to do the program, is because ultimately I do want to go down the route of academia. Yeah, I guess to this day, I still teach. Yesterday, we kicked off a health system course at UofT. So yeah, the research component, continuing to find ways that we can make our profession better, continuing to find ways that we can meet patient health needs, while also, making sure that our pharmacists are well supported when they provide these services, whether it be financial supports in terms of remuneration or education and training, just to make sure that we want to provide the most for our patients, but we also want to allow a safety net for them and just
Amazing,
ensure that that's in place.
for sure. And having mentioned academia, what's one change you would like to bring to the table, like once become a professor?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things that I think of when I think of creating possibly my own research group in the future is how I can make my research very connected to pharmacy practice. And so this is why, even throughout my PhD and throughout my postdoctoral studies, I guess, or training, I try and connect as much as I can with pharmacy organizations, like sector organizations. So, when I was doing my PhD, I was writing articles for the Pharmacy Guild of New Zealand. I still continue to do the same throughout my postdoctoral studies. It's very important to connect with the profession and make your research something that they can actually utilize out there and practice. Because there's no way that we're going to make the profession better if we don't conduct this research, if we don't come up with better methods to care for our patients. And so for me, sort of thinking ahead, I really like to collaborate with knowledge users. I like to collaborate with patients. I think it's very important to empower the patient voice when it comes to health research. And I think it's very important to collaborate with knowledge users, stakeholders, policymakers, to make sure that the findings of our research can actually be used by them and can actually basically be utilized to implement new services or even amend existing services. So I've done quite a bit of work on equity as well, because of course back home in New Zealand we have a large indigenous population, known as Maori. And so for us, unfortunately, Maori have a large health disparity when compared to the non-Indigenous population. And so a lot of the work that I did there was on equity within the School of Public Health. And, it's those things that have the ability to impact practice. It's those things that we as pharmacists can learn from. So for me, bridging the gap, if you like, between academia and practice is very important. Thinking ahead, for future research, but also pretty much all the research that I've done to date has, it's been a foundation of everything that I've done up until this point.
That's remarkable. And what is one piece of advice you would like to give to pharmacy students who are just graduating and entering the workforce?
Yeah, okay. So actually, there's a lot of advice that I can give, but I will try and distill it down into, I would say, two key messages. The first thing is when you're going through pharmacy school, try and find an area that you're passionate about. So, going through pharmacy school, I remember my dad used to always tell me at the end of pretty much every lecture when he would pick me up, he used to say to me, "Have you identified the area of pharmacy that you want to specialize in?" And I used to, at that point I was a third year pharmacy student. And I used to tell my dad, "No, dad, like it's too early. We haven't learned the whole curriculum. I still haven't identified what I want to specialize in." And then he used to tell me, he's like, "Okay, well, as you go through pharmacy school, just think, do you want to be yet another pharmacist, yet another statistic? pharmacist number, 5,482? Or do you actually want to be a pharmacist that makes a change to your profession and impacts your community as a whole? And so that sort of continued with me. And it continued to the year that I went into my hospital pharmacy internship, because when you go, never underestimate that first and second year of pharmacy practice, because you're very fresh to the whole system. So you might think, oh, I'm fresh, I'm inexperienced, but actually having fresh eyes over something is very beneficial, because you'll be able to identify the problems that exist and come up with solutions. We often say we want sort of innovative practice. So a lot of that innovation, you start thinking of that innovation pretty much as soon as you go into practice. So, being young pharmacists is a huge bonus, because you're going into an environment that you would otherwise, you haven't been really exposed to in the past, I would say. So yeah, be mindful of your surroundings, be very attentive to your patient needs, and find gaps in practice that you would come up with solutions for. And, first and foremost, at the center of everything you do is the health and well-being of your patient.
Oh, that's awesome. That's a very actually wonderful advice that I think is very relevant to the issues that new grads face.
Yeah,
Well, thank you so much, Yasmin, for being a guest speaker on my channel. It's been such a pleasure.
it's been a pleasure to meet you too. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, good luck to all the pharmacy students out there. I really enjoyed, following the student journey. So I'll be sure to follow you too, Masa.
Thank you.